My name's Julie, and in this video I'm going to be talking about language and communication for children and young people seeking sanctuary and how schools might support this. This is part of a series of videos that are part of the Improving Teaching to Improve Refugee Education project. So if we think of a child or a young person arriving in a host school, it may be that the language that is spoken there isn't familiar to them. Children and young people are expected to engage with their lessons in the first language of the host school, as well as start to learn the host school's language. Language is really important. It forms part of our culture, part of our identity. There's a model which is Hall's iceberg theory of culture. And in the iceberg theory, Hall talks about the top 10%, which is the tip of the iceberg, and how this part is what we can see very easily. What we can see, what we can hear, what we might be able to taste, smell, and experience in that multisensory way. So things like food and celebrations and festivals and language form part of that top 10%. But culture is much more than that, and getting to really understand someone's culture means going much deeper than that 10% of the iceberg. However, language is a good start, and so it's important to think about the best way that schools and children seeking sanctuary might be able to communicate with one another. Maintaining the young person's first language or their heritage language is an important part of their culture and their identity. It might be that children seeking sanctuary have already learnt a second language throughout their journey to the arrival in their host school. So it could be that they speak more than one language already, and they might be very proficient language learners. So on arrival at school, it's really helpful if there's someone who is bilingual support assistant or speaks the child or young person's first language. Or it may be that there are some peer buddies or other young people within the school setting that already speak the language too. And this might help to ascertain what proficiency the child or young person already has in their heritage language, and also to ascertain as to whether or not they have an additional need in their first language. So assessing the pupil's language skills would be one of the first steps in ensuring that the child's language learning is efficient and is supportive of them settling in quickly to their new setting. Paradis, Chen and Ramos undertook some research into language literacy and the social integration of refugee children and youth. And what they concluded was that second language or language 2 and literacy development are the gateway to successful educational outcomes. And these obviously can affect the life course and opportunities that children and youth are then have available to them. So it will affect how they perform when they come to get a job in later life, as well as a whole series of social, cultural and economic outcomes. But at the same time, the maintenance of the heritage first language is really essential for family well-being and cohesion. So schools might think initially about non-verbal methods of communication. So these are important to provide a way of communicating initially on arrival, to reassure the child or young person and to give them the tools to be able to express their wants and needs. So things like sign language or symbols, or somebody using something visual to enable people to communicate with each other is really helpful. Even the use of Google Translate or a similar app on a phone just allows to make meaning known. It's not always completely accurate, but it does enable people to get the gist. Later on, engaging children and young people in group activities where there's relaxed opportunities for children and young people to communicate with each other is supportive in developing language skills. So developing the language of the playground, for example, and that social language that's needed. Using the language that's already understood when it comes to reading and writing activities is very supportive, because children will be able to then make the connection between what they see on the page and what they have heard within the classroom and the playground. Sometimes there's a silent period where the child or young person is just listening to what's being said in the playground, in the classroom, during whole class inputs, and they're just listening and they're perhaps not confident enough to try speaking. That's all part of the process of starting to learn a language, and should just be allowed to happen. Children shouldn't be forced to try and speak if they're not comfortable to do so. Clear and concise modelling of classroom activities is very supportive of developing vocabulary and understanding. And using a subject-specific word bank is really helpful, particularly at secondary, if there's technical language that's being used in a science lesson or a geography lesson, for example. There needs to be a consideration as to whether the additional language teaching of the second language happens in a one-to-one situation or small group situation away from the class, or whether language learning will just happen as part of day-to-day classroom activity. And that's going to be very dependent on the individual and what they feel comfortable with. It might be very comforting to be taken out of the class and to spend a bit of time with a group of other people that speak the same language as you, but then other people might prefer just to stay with their friends in their classroom. Any language teaching needs to be meaningful and in a context as well. So it doesn't need to solely rely on phonics teaching. And while that's very helpful, it needs to be much richer and have lots of meaningful opportunities for children to try out everyday language that they might need to use when they're out at the shops or perhaps in the library, and communicating with other people in their new community. MacLeod, Messiaen and Pesco undertook some research that were case studies around language abilities of children with refugee backgrounds. And they concluded that language learning enabled young people to foster resiliency, because it enabled them to build bridges. And there was a very important factor in that was the communication with home, because parents were able to support language learning, both in the language of the home, in the heritage language, but also in the language of the host school, in the second language too. So it's important to maintain that frequent communication with home, and that could be done in a variety of ways. Homeschool liaison books or planners might be really useful. Parents appreciate it if teachers and teaching assistants make the effort to try and translate one or two phrases into the heritage language. You can use translation apps. Again, they might not be 100% accurate, but it does show that you've made an effort. Riddick and Chopra undertook a study of language and education for young people seeking sanctuary in Uganda and the Lebanon. And they found, and they concluded in their research, that young people had 3 specific needs when they arrived in their new host country. And those needs were the need for opportunity, the need for connection, and the need for stable roots. So language and communication learning would really support children and young people having these 3 needs met. And so careful consideration about what a setting might do in terms of teaching a language as an additional language to the heritage language, will go some way to helping the successful and welcoming inclusion of a child or young person seeking sanctuary.